we'll be recording this session for you so that you can use it for future use. And without any further ado, please note during the webinar, we will have all of your lines placed on mute and take your questions through the questions dialog box with GoToWebinar. That way it allows us to share all of the questions with the audience and allow you to all hear the answers to those questions. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Paul Benyon.
Good morning, everybody. Glad to have you attending this course, the Principles of Estimating course, and we'll go ahead and get started. The first thing that I wanted to do is give you a little bit of background about hard dollar. Just real quickly, some of you may be new to hard dollar and just wanted to fill you in a little bit about what we do. So hard dollar, we are all about project cost management. And what we mean by that is we really shine in these three areas that you see up at the top. We do cost model estimating, very detailed estimating. We also do measuring of your progress on the project control side, and we allow you to be able to come up with a good forecast of where you're going to end up on your project at the end. So we really specifically work in those areas, and then we also have key integration points with these other areas in the design, scheduling, and also connecting up with your ERP or financial system, your accounting system, because there's some key information that's obviously influencing the cost of your project from those other areas. And so we bring all of that together into one place on one platform, which is what we call the Project Cost Management Platform. So just wanted to fill you in on what we do in case you're new to who we are. But let's go ahead and get started. So the agenda for today, we're going to first of all talk about cost estimating best practices. You know, if you're looking at those that really put together good cost estimates, what do they do and how do those estimates look? We'll second look at cost estimating challenges. Cost estimating, I'm sure many of you out there know the challenges that there are. It's not an exact science. It's not easy to do. And we'll look at some of those challenges and how we can alleviate those through these best practices that we're talking about. And last of all, we're going to talk about cost estimating workflow. What's the actual process? If we were starting from the ground up, how would we put an estimate together? So cost estimating best practices. Let's look into this a little bit. And if we were going to start from the very beginning, maybe it's good to start with just a basic definition of what is cost estimating. This comes from Project Management Institute, and they define cost estimating as the process of developing an approximation of the monetary resources needed to complete project activities. So if we break that down a little bit, let's say we're building this bridge. Well, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to figure out what tasks are involved, what activities are we going to do to build this bridge. We're going to try to break it down into pieces. Maybe we're going to do the piling work to establish the foundation for the bridge. And we're going to do a lot of concrete work. We're going to do some cabling, and we're going to do some paving. And all of these individual activities, they add up to total up what the whole project is. But by breaking it down into those smaller pieces, we can start to measure it. And then we're approximating the monetary resources. So we're figuring out, okay, to do each one of those tasks, to do the piling work, what kind of crew would be involved with that? Would we have certain types of labor that we're using? What kinds of piling equipment would we use? And there's a dollar amount for each of those resources, whether it's labor, equipment, or materials. As we start to build the project up with those resources are going to have rates associated with them, costs associated with them, and really it's the totaling up of that builds the cost estimate. So if we're looking at best practices of how we'd put a cost estimate together, there's a few shoulds. A cost estimate should, first of all, identify and consider possibly multiple cost alternatives for completing the project. So in other words, we're not just going to approach it one way and assume that that's the best way from the get-go. One example of this, I was just working with a contractor that was doing some pipe utility work up in a ceiling at a facility, and it was in a really confined space where there's a lot of cabling and a lot of stuff running through there. And it turns out that to meet spec, it looked like this was going to be too high of temperature. It was going to get too hot up there. So they had to come up with a couple of alternatives to come up with the best way to handle it. And one alternative was they could lower the ceiling, give themselves some more room for the heat to dissipate. And the other alternative was use a different kind of pipe that absorbs the heat better. So they could weigh both of those alternatives and come up with, really what is the best option for us from a cost standpoint, from a timing standpoint. Second A cost estimate should be refined to reflect additional detail as it becomes available for the cost estimate. You see this example a lot when you're doing an owner's or an engineer's estimate, and it goes through different phases, starting with obviously a very conceptual phase at the beginning. We know maybe that we're going to build a highway. We know we want it to have 4 lanes. We want it to be 10 miles, and we have a rough estimate at that point of how much it's going to cost. But there's a lot of unknowns at that point. As we learn more detail, maybe we learn that it's not going to be able to run right through this neighborhood. We're not going to be able to mitigate that. Instead, we got to go around the neighborhood. Well, obviously, that's going to be a scope change that affects our costs and affects the project. So we need to keep our estimate as up-to-date as possible with as much detail as we can have. Of course, this is a given. It needs to include all the costs of the project, but I do want to point out that in addition to the direct costs for labor, equipment, materials pertaining to the deliverable items of the project, we also have indirect costs. We want to make sure that we are including all of the different overhead factors, whatever we have going on, the job trailer on site, or the utilities for that trailer, all of our staffing with their trucks and their equipment that they are using, and especially we need to be considering risk factors and try to wrap our arms around the unknowns as much as we can. And we can cover that with contingency and other methods. So what are the characteristics of a credible cost estimate? The information here comes from a study, the source being the federal government's accounting office, which looks at all of the estimating practices for the Department of Defense and the other departments in the federal government. These apply well to any cost estimate that's being put together. There's 8 of them here. The first one is to have clear identification of the task. So as we're just in the very beginning stages, the estimator is given the task of putting this project together, or maybe a team of estimators. We really don't want to disservice them by giving them inadequate information. They need as much detail of description, the ground rules and assumptions, and technical characteristics of the project. They need to know of any constraints, any conditions. They all need to be as clearly identified as possible and well documented for the estimator to really get off on the right foot. There also needs to be broad participation in the preparation phase of the project. So we really want to make sure that all of the stakeholders are being included, whether it's government agency, the community, project managers, the estimators, the planners. Everybody needs to give their input and together come up with and decide on the mission of the project and be detailed about the requirements of the project and its parameters. And we need to also have that reviewed independently so that we can verify and confirm that it is complete, it is reliable, the plan that we're starting off with. Now, as the estimate starts to get put together, one common theme among all the truly credible cost estimates is that they're based on availability of valid data. In other words, what resources are at the estimator's disposal to confirm and make sure that his assumptions are based on fact as much as possible. So that is the collecting and the storing of past projects, past work that's been done, where we can look at it in detail and reuse that information and play smart about the assumptions that we're coming up with. There needs to be a standardized structure for the estimate. A lot of times things get assumed and are estimated at too broad of a level. Those components, those tasks, say we're doing some of the concrete for that bridge. If we just put in foundation and leave it at that and try to wrap our minds around that, it's too broad for us to really understand what resources are going to be needed for that. But if we can break it down into the setting of the forms, the pouring of the concrete, and then the takedown, well, we know the crews that are going to be involved with each one of those tasks. It's easier for us to understand how much it's going to cost and how productive they can be. So that work breakdown structure is really critical, and it also makes sure that we aren't omitting out any costs that we didn't foresee in the project. We also, like I mentioned before, we really need to take any risks into consideration. Some of those risks we're going to be able to foresee, some of them we're not. The ones that we can foresee, we want to include those as items in our estimate and have costs for them. And we also want to have a bucket of some sort, contingency or what have you, that we can draw down on to apply to the unforeseen things that are for sure going to come up, guaranteed in any project. We know there will be some surprises as much as we try not to have them, and we need to make sure we're covered. One of the things that we can plan on is to keep track of inflation as much as we can. We know how the market is trending to a point, and we can make some predictions on where it's going to be in the future for the labor force, for our materials, and we need to include those extra costs when we're working with multi-year contracts and include that so that that doesn't come back to bite us later on when we're actually executing the work. Another thing that is interesting is part of the accountability of the estimate is making sure that when we do need to exclude costs that we document that there's full disclosure, if you will, about anything that has been decided to be excluded and the rationale behind that. And last of all, we want to make sure that there's somebody that is a third party looking over the estimate once it's been put together to ensure that it's independently reviewed, any modifications or corrections that need to be made can be made, so that this can truly establish the confidence that our plan is good, that it's based as much on science as it can be going forward, and kind of gets rid of being over-optimistic about some of the tasks. So that's a quick look at the characteristics of cost estimate. Now let's talk about the challenges a little bit, because as you know, cost estimating is not an easy task. It involves facts as much as we can, but there's judgments that have to be made. And we want to make sure that those judgments are made as much based on fact as possible. You can see on the right-hand side here an example of a lot of the typical challenges that are out there. And on the left, you can see some of those best practices that we were talking about, the detailed documentation and planning. Of course, having an adequate cost reserve, having it well-defined, including analysis of risk, and making sure we have a stable program we're working with, adequate budget. Like I talked about before, making sure that we have the historical data set to be able to draw from is going to go probably the longest way in being able to build a good estimate. Sometimes that is a challenge because that historical data, in other words, how have we done in the past, is based on experience and it's in someone's head. I'm sure you guys have experienced this to some degree where you have the more experienced estimators. They are able to be quite accurate, but it's not necessarily written down or entered into a database. So you have the newer workforce coming up that doesn't have that information and that knowledge and experience. So there's a shift that needs to be made of getting that information out of people's heads and into a database so that it can be used for the future estimators. But as you can see, these challenges can really start to weigh down the balance here and shift the balance if we're not careful. If we don't have the well-trained staff and the cost history, then we can be the victims of some of the things you see on the right. Unrealistic assumptions, over-optimism, unreasonable baselines. You can see I'm just picking out a few of them there. Even technology can be a disservice if it's not used correctly, if people aren't trained up on how to use the new software or whatever is being used, then it becomes a disservice. It really comes back to taking the time to make sure that whatever it takes, the resources that will be using it can get up to speed and put it to good use. So along with these challenges and these best practices, there's also, for the cost estimate, certain inputs that are necessary to put an estimate together. And really the natural starting point for that is the project deliverables. These would be the list of items that really define how the project is going to be built. What are the high-level deliverable items? These are the items that the owner agrees to pay the contractor for. And in hard dollar, we happen to refer to these as pay items. So you want to list those out. And then from there, we're going to break down those items into the work breakdown structure. We're going to start to cost it out and figure out at as detailed of a level as we can what is the labor, equipment, and materials that are going to be used for each of the tasks that's necessary to make the estimate happen. And of course, using direct and indirect costs. Now, from a contractor standpoint, once we have defined our costs, of course, we're going to mark things up and put on profit. In hard dollar, we use a form for that called the price breakdown structure. That's where we define our profit. Now, there's some other factors that are going to influence the project as well. The project schedule, while it is often calculated separately from the estimate, the one affects the other. So if I am scheduling something out and we need to do it in less time, well, then the decision needs to be made. How are we going to accomplish that, and how much will it cost us? So the one affects the other, and they really need to be looked at in tandem, and the two departments need to work together to make sure that, that there's a clear understanding of the two constraints, cost and time. We have been talking about risk, one of the biggest factors in a project. One important input is to make sure that there is some sort of a risk register. So as you're looking at your work breakdown structure, you're able to identify item by item what level of risk is that item. Is it low, medium, high? And you may even use some risk analysis kind of software that plugs in to allow you to be able to calculate that. That needs to be on the radar as you're putting the estimate together so that extra dollars can be allocated for some of those items. And then environmental factors. You have external factors that are out there. Maybe there's government restrictions or constraints that need to be met. There's climate, even if the work is going to be done in the winter months and so forth, that needs to be considered as the estimate is being put together. Okay, so we've looked at best practices and challenges. Well, we're to the final and the remainder of the course, which is looking at an example workflow. What is the process of putting an estimate together? Now, we'll happen to use hard dollar as the estimating tool for the examples that we show, but the inputs are the same regardless of what you're using. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to establish those project deliverables that we were talking about. Now, this may vary a little bit depending on what kind of contract you're using. If you're doing a unit price contract, then clearly there's going to be a list of pay items that the owner provides, even may provide the quantities as well, with the understanding that the owner will pay off of those deliverables as they are completed. Now, there might be a lump sum contract. In that case, you may not even use a listing of deliverables, and that's okay. You would just simply skip this step. But let's go and take a look in hard dollar at where these are defined. It's in a form that's called the Pay Item and Proposal Register. Now, it's called the Pay Item and Proposal Register because this is also where the proposal and the final proposed price is calculated in hard dollar. If you're using some other source, you'd be going through the same kind of process when you're finishing up the cost estimate, which we will cover in a few minutes. But let's go and look at where we actually put in the deliverables. If I just jump over to hard dollar, here you can see I have an estimating project that I'm just beginning. I'm in that pay item screen, and I'm going to list out any deliverables that we have. We're just going to list a couple of them here. One for mobilizing all of our equipment, which I just put in as a lump sum. And then let's do an example of maybe some underground utility work. Let's say we are installing 36-inch reinforced concrete pipe, 1,000 linear feet of it. So you can see I'm putting in the quantity as well. And I would go through this kind of a process, whatever I'm using. You got to establish what are those deliverable items. And this list, depending on what kind of software you're using, you may be able to, instead of manually entering them in, you could import them in or copy them in like you can in hard dollar. But once you have those established, the next input to enter in is your resources. You want to make sure that you have defined already in advance, you've already figured out what's the resources that we typically use. In other words, if you're looking at labor, what are the laborers that, or the types of labor that we use? What operators? Maybe you have an operator class 1, 2, 3, something like that. You have laborers, you have the foremen, you have carpenters, iron workers, whatever kind of work you're doing. You want to go ahead and classify all those. Now you'll notice that I'm listing out 7 main categories, what we call resource types. These are the categories that Hard Dollar has defined, but you certainly don't have to define them exactly like this. You maybe just have LEM, labor, equipment, materials, and keep it simple like that. Hard Dollar just breaks down equipment into a couple extra categories. But the main thing is that you want to make sure you have your individual resources defined with the costs associated with them. So let's go look at how that might look in Hard Dollar. So I'm going to open up the Forms menu and go to Resource Rate. And here you see those same categories listed. That's, again, how Hard Dollar breaks them up. Labor, I have different classifications for it. It's just taking my carpenters, I have it broken into apprentice and journeyman and foreman, and that allows me to define a cost associated with each one of those. Once I have these costs defined, I'm going to be able to start to build up my estimate and grab the particular resources I need for my crew and define what my costs are. You'll notice in this particular example, we also allow for different scales of that rate. Just think of when you're working overtime or double time, you might make a little extra cash, and that's what we're including in there. So this is just one example of how you can have your resources set up, and you can have them for the different resource types. So that would be set up beforehand, and then the next step, and as it says here, these are the building blocks for the project. Then we're going to want to define a work breakdown structure like we talked about. We want this to be as detailed as it can be so that we can really justify every number that we're coming up with. We can have it backed up with a crew and how much that crew is able to do. So if there's any question at any point during the project, we can go back to that and find that number. So you can see in Hard Dollar, we happen to refer to the work breakdown structure as a cost breakdown structure just because we're focused on costs. And it's basically just an outline of your costs. It's going to be a hierarchy of superior items and then child items below them. And this can also be categorized for budgeting purposes. And each one of those cost items, or excuse me, each row in that breakdown structure, we refer to that as a cost item, but it's really an activity that's being done to do the work. We're pouring the concrete. We're we're installing the piling. So these are actions that are actually getting done. These are the activities, and then we're going to apply the resources onto those activities. Okay. One other point that we wanted to make clear is when you're working with your work breakdown structure, you're going to be using your own quantities, your forecast quantities, because you are forecasting your costs. So rather than using quantities that maybe come from the owner if you're a contractor. So let's take a look at how a work breakdown structure can be set up for those two items that we were working with. So I'm going to jump out of my resource list there and go into the cost breakdown structure. So as you can see here, it brings up a new form, and I have up at the top I have a few rows here listing what would be indirect costs. These are default ones that happen to come with Hard Dollar, but these would be whatever you would be defining. Maybe you have an add-on percentage that you use to figure out what your overhead cost is going to be, or maybe you have particular staffing that you want to, or staffing resources you want to add in there. We're going to kind of skip over the indirect costs for the moment and jump down to our two direct items. You can see we have our mobilization and our pipe. Let's say we want to break down the pipe because it's kind of difficult for us to know how to cost that out. We want to break it into 4 pieces. So I'm going to insert a few child items here. And maybe the first one is just to figure out what materials we need. So I create one called furnish materials to figure out how much pipe we need. And then I'm just going to think of the tasks that are at hand. Well, first to install that pipe, we've got to dig a trench for it. So maybe we're going to do excavate trench. And now the trench is going to be in cubic yards, so I'm able to go ahead and put in whatever quantity and unit of measure I want there. And then I'm going to install the pipe, and then I'm going to backfill the trench, cover it up with the dirt. Okay, and less dirt now because we have pipe in there. We're just going to do 1,200 cubic yards. And just like that, I'm able to break things down. Now this is a little more manageable for me. That's how I like to look at it. You might have a different way that you would break that up. But the key is getting it to a manageable chunk that we can figure out the resources for. So I would continue with whatever items I have to go ahead and establish that work breakdown. Once I've done that, the next step is, of course, to define the costs on those. And as you can see here, I have 3 different ways that typically people will define costs. They're going to do one of 3 things. They're going to figure out the detail themselves. They're going to say, okay, here's the guys that would be working on that task. Here's the equipment we'd be using, and here's the material. And they would figure out their rates, and they would they'd figure out how much they can do in a day of that activity to come up with productivity. That's the detailed approach. That's the real best practice where you're using crews and productivity. There is another way, and you still see it out there. It's not the best way. It's not the most accurate way, but there is a place for it where you're just going to put in a cost per unit. That 1,000 linear feet of pipe, I'm just going to assume it's $20 a linear foot, whatever we might consider there. Quick and easy, but when I want to go back and support that number that I came up with, I don't really have any data backing it up. So we don't really encourage that. A good use for that would be maybe you're waiting for a quote from a subcontractor and you want to have something in there, so you plug in your number. That takes us to the third option, and obviously even as a prime contractor, there's going to be some items that you're going to subcontract out most likely, and so that's the third thing you could do is just get a quote for the dollar amount and get that from the subcontractor. So let's look at how we can handle these costs. We'll do the detail and the plug example. So if I jump back to hard dollar, let's say mobilization, we're just going to plug in a cost for that at this point. So I simply open up that item and I say I want to plug $10,000 for labor and $10,000 for equipment. So as you can see, I've entered that in, and that will then, if I select that cost source, I now have $20,000 that I've plugged in for mobilization. And I would just leave it at that. Again, if anyone came back and asked me, well, where did you come up with $10,000 for labor and equipment? I can't really point to any resources or anything, so it's not the most accurate approach, right? Well, let's jump down a little bit and take a look at the detailed kind of approach, what we'd really encourage for a good cost estimate. So if we're looking at the furnished materials, let's open that up. To come up with the material, I've already set up a list of all of my materials, as you can see here on my materials list, and I can scroll down and find 36-inch pipe where I've already put in that it's $25 per foot. Okay, so now when I put that in, it's just a matter of saying how much pipe do we need. It's 1,000 linear feet, but I'm going to put in, say, 1,100 because of waste factor. So I now have 1,100 linear feet of pipe at $25, and it generates this total cost, which I can also see up above for this item. Okay, easy for me to break that out because I broke out my materials separately. For my other items, I can do kind of the same thing, but for these other items, I'm not figuring out material. I'm figuring out, what are the crews involved to actually do the work, the labor and the equipment. So if I open up excavate trench, one thing that I might do is have a bunch of my resources grouped together in a crew. So I can go to what we call assembly and grab a pipe crew, and it brings in a whole listing of, here's all the laborers, here's all the equipment that's needed to excavate that trench, okay, and with the quantities of each of that resource that I need. Then over on the right-hand side, you can see where for any estimate, whatever tool you're using, you're going to want to figure out, of course, how long is it going to take to do that, because all of this labor and equipment is hourly based, and that's going to drive their costs. So I might put in the number of days or hours I think it's going to take, or I could even put in, how many cubic yards can we do in a day or in an hour. Let's say we can do 300 cubic yards a day. Now this is also where that best practice that we were talking about of consulting your past information and having a database to draw from. You can do things like benchmarking and looking up of your past projects to see whenever we've excavated a trench in the past, how did we do? How did we actually do out there? So we can be smarter the next time around when we're estimating. That's really key. So I know from the last time that on average we're able to do with this crew 300 cubic yards a day, so I can feel pretty confident about that number. When I put that in, it automatically calculates for me the days, the hours, all the other information I need. It factors with the quantity of each resource to give me a final cost. Okay. Now I can go ahead and do the same thing on these other items that we'll do real quick just to get costs in there. On the installing of the pipe, I'm going to insert that same pipe crew, and I'm going to say they can do it in 2 days, which fills in all this other production information, gives me a total cost, and then finally I can do the same thing with backfill trench. We'll go ahead and put in that same crew and give them a production value. Maybe they're able to backfill 300 cubic yards a day. So that gives me all of my direct costs, and you can see the work breakdown, the way it works. I've defined it at the child levels, but it all rolls up to the parent level. So now 36-inch pipe has a unit and a total cost. And that's really the approach that is best to take, that bottoms-up approach for coming up with a good detailed estimate. But then we have indirect costs. I'll just do an example of that. Let's say that there's an indirect cost that we come up with that's really based on a markup of all of these direct costs. So I go into this one called direct cost add-on. I'm going to open that up, and I'm going to go ahead and put in an item called job overhead. As you can see, I have it listed here. And I've already put in a rate there, but maybe I want it to be a 15% markup of all of my direct costs that I see here. And that generates now some indirect costs, some overhead dollars that's going to be added into the project. I would want to foresee any risks at all possible, so I might create a contingency kind of bucket for my indirect costs, which I could do here as well. I could also bring up maybe another column that I use to indicate the risk level, whether it's, and I could identify item by item, whether it's high, low, medium risk. Those are all the factors that I want to be considering as we're going along here for coming up with our costs. Jumping right along here, the next step, if I'm the contractor, would be to define profit. And again, you can see on the screen it says PBS. That's a hard dollar term standing for price breakdown structure. That happens to be the place where profit can be entered in. But the key is, on top of your cost, you're going to be coming up with a profit amount. And the target price is a summary of your costs and your profit added together. So let's just take a look at where we do that in hard dollar. Now that we've come up with the cost of the estimate, I'm going to go into the PBS, or price breakdown structure. I'm going to collapse down the view here. We're really just going to focus on the left-hand side here, where I can see how does my price break down. I see a total amount here of $82,000, and if I expand it a little bit, I see that I have a target profit that I've defined of 10%. Okay, so basically I came in here and I put in 10%. Again, I could change that, make it 15% if I wanted to, and it generates a new profit. That's basically coming from a markup of my total cost. The total cost we see here below, it consists of indirect costs and direct costs. You can see how this all kind of builds on top of each other, and we end up with a final price. So So if I was doing a lump sum kind of contract where there's just a final dollar amount, then I could be done at this point from an estimating standpoint. I broke everything out, broke those deliverables down in my work breakdown structure, figured out the costs, built it up, added profit, and now I have a final number. But for those of you that are doing unit price kind of work, where those deliverables really drive your payment, I'm going to need to take this price and decide how am I going to spread it over that list of deliverables. And that kind of takes us to the final screen here, which is where I am going to decide how do I want the pricing that I've come up with to be applied to these two deliverable items. Okay? I could manually come in and just type in the unit price that I want for those, but in hard dollar there happens to be a tool to do that automatically to get me started, and so I'm going to do that, and notice what it's done is it's now taken that pricing and it proportionately spread it over those two items for me. So whether you're using an automated kind of tool like that or you're doing it just on your own, that's going to be obviously a key part for a unit price kind of contract. Is you get to be you decide, how are we going to distribute all of this cost and profit over these deliverable items. At this point, I would be ready to send a proposal. I've put a full estimate together. So you can see the basic inputs that we had talked about before, putting in the deliverables, putting in or creating our cost breakdown structure, defining the costs, both direct and indirect, and then going and putting in our profit, and then finally, if necessary, distributing that overhead cost and profit over our deliverable items. So let's just jump back to the hard dollar slides and sum things up a little bit. So what we've talked about in this course is, first of all, we established some best practices for cost estimating, and we've also looked at some of the challenges that we really want to try to get around. And then finally, we looked at an actual workflow of putting an estimate together. So that being said, we'll turn it over to you to see if there's any questions, and we'll just take a look at our question board here and see if there's anything we can answer for you.
Okay, yes, Paul, we have a question. Is there a screen to view markup money applied to an individual pay item, labor, and equipment?
Okay, great question. So let's jump back to hard dollar and actually take a look at how that looks. So back here, we're on the screen where we're looking at the pay items. And right here on this register, we are able to look at the percentage margin. Now, the percentage margin listed here is all together, all labor, equipment, and materials. And it is margin, which is a little bit different than markup, as I'm sure you're aware. But that's one place where things are listed. There also is an excellent report that actually was added just about one release ago, located under our report module. If I go to the pay item and proposal portion of that, this is just the reporting module for hard dollar. There's one called pay item price breakdown. This might be new to you guys. May not be aware that this is here, but let's just go ahead and create this real quick so you can see what it looks like. So I'll browse to, let's see, to my desktop, and we'll call this price breakdown. And what this is going to do is it's going to list my pay items and give me the full price breakdown on a pay item by pay item basis that includes the breakout of my costs with labor, equipment, and materials. So as you can see, it puts it in Excel. Yes, we do want to stamp out spreadsheets. As you can see here, it shows my total price, first of all, and I get a full breakdown of the price as listed here. And then I can look at each of those items by direct cost. So, for example, when I click on that tab, you can see if I scroll across, it's it's showing me the full breakdown, all of our cost categories that we use, so I can see exactly where labor, equipment, materials is allocated. This being in Excel, it's modifiable, so you can get rid or hide any columns that you don't want to be showing.
Okay, thanks, Paul. We have a couple more questions that have come in. Are you capable of breaking down pipe size by possible locations, since the depth of a trench may vary, excavated material, etc.?
Yes, excellent question. So the work breakdown structure, the important thing is that it gets broken down according to what your needs are. And I think the question is particularly for hard dollar. Yes, you can. The work breakdown structure is open and flexible, where you really can define it any way that you would like. So if I was to just kind of jump back to hard dollar and go to that cost breakdown structure, you know, I've broken this down assuming it's all at one height or one size of pipe or whatever, but maybe I have a second one. So what I could do is, for example, I'll do a quick example here. Maybe it's you know, area 1 and area 2 that I'm going to create. So I'm just going to insert those in. And then I can take the detail that I had created and I can copy it into each of those areas. So now I have that detail under area 1, and I can also put the detail under area 2. Let me copy that again. Just copy and paste. So now I have it broken up whatever way I need to define it. The breakdown structure is to meet your needs, so it's open to define any way that you need.
Okay, here's another question. We break down our estimate into 3 sections: labor, equipment, and material. But the end report shows other items on the sheet. How can we just show these 3 items only with all the markups?
Okay, that might be one that we need to take offline. I'd need a little bit more information. So maybe if you could, just in the Q&A there, if you wouldn't mind indicating your email, I'd be happy to get with you personally and can see what your particular scenario is there, if that's okay.
Okay. After generating your cost estimate, how might you generate an itemized output? For example, cost item by cost item price estimate to present to your customer. Is there a standard report in HD for this?
Yes, so again, I would refer you to our report module. We have a number of different reports that you can run for your final proposal. We looked at one of those where it was in a lot of detail, where it showed the full breakdown of the price. Now, getting down to a resource level, the price per resource, that almost sounds like more like a time and materials kind of example. And hard dollar does have the ability to handle that type of work, where you are looking at maybe the invoice that you're going to give to the owner with the listing out of all of your resources and their billing rates. You can define what that billing rate would be at the resource level. Instead of the cost for a resource, you would have a price per resource. And yeah, that's just another report that we can run here. I'll just show you really quick. You have billing rate report. Give you one example of that, where we look at the details of this estimate. Maybe this is more of a time and materials kind of estimate, where I basically say, okay, Mr. Owner, here is the 36-inch pipe we worked on. Here's the crew, and here's their rate. These would be the rate including profit for you to get paid.
Okay. Where do you show overhead percentage on each item of the bid?
Okay, showing the overhead percentage on each item of the bid. Again, that kind of goes back to, it's similar to the questions before, I suppose, where, but it's at maybe the item level, the activity level, rather than at a labor, equipment, resource level. Again, that would be back to that breakdown. See, I'm just kind of thinking on the fly here. one thing that you can do is inside of the cost breakdown structure, I can pull up a pricing column to see how was that pricing percentage distributed back. See if I can just find it here real quick. Let's see. I may not be able to find it right here on the fly, but I can definitely get that for you. It's a column that you can pull up where it shows that kind of distribution for you. So feel free to shoot me an email and I'll send that to you.
Okay, Paul. We have no more questions at this time. We want to give you one last opportunity to ask a question by submitting it through the question and answer toolbar with GoToWebinar. And it looks like at this point we don't have any other questions. So I just wanted to provide you kind of next steps and what you can expect. You'll receive, following the webinar today, an email with a link to a quiz following the session. Once you successfully complete the quiz, we will send you electronically a certificate, so you can use that for your professional development, any professional development credits that you may need. You can also include on your resume that you have completed the Principles of Estimating certification. And with that, if you were interested in any other more in-depth training on how to apply the technology and tools with hard dollar to improve your estimating process, we have a list of our upcoming classes. If you were interested, you can give Tracy McBroom a call. She can be reached at 480-776-2924, and we'll also include her contact and information in the follow-up email. And with that, thank you so much for your questions and your time today, and we look forward to offering you other certifications throughout the year, and we'll let you know what those are following the holidays. Have a great day.